For over a decade, the Iron Dome has been presented as something close to a miracle. The numbers are extraordinary enough to feel like science fiction, a mobile defense system that tracks incoming rockets in real time, calculates their trajectory, and destroys only those headed for populated areas, claiming success rates above 90% across multiple conflicts. In military circles and popular media alike, it became the symbol of how technology could solve the oldest problem of urban warfare: the terror of indiscriminate rocket fire against civilian populations. But there is a misconception buried in this narrative. The Iron Dome was never designed to be a perfect shield. It was designed to buy something far more valuable than physical protection. It was meant to buy time for political leaders to make rational decisions rather than being forced into immediate, overwhelming retaliation after every attack. The system's creators understood that no defense can stop everything. What they believed was that by intercepting enough, by making the cost of rocket fire unacceptable to the enemy, they could change the strategic calculus entirely. That theory has now been tested to destruction. And what the past 2 years have revealed is not a failure of technology, but a failure of how we understand the relationship between defense and deterrence. The Iron Dome works exactly as designed. The question is whether working as designed was ever enough. To understand what the Iron Dome actually is, you have to start with what it was built to replace. Before 2011, Israel had no effective defense against the short-range rockets fired from Gaza and Lebanon. During the 2006 Lebanon War, Hezbollah launched more than 4,000 rockets into northern Israel over 34 days. Civilians had seconds to find shelter, entire cities emptied. The existing air defense systems, designed for aircraft and ballistic missiles, were useless against crude, unguided projectiles fired from a few miles away. The Iron Dome filled that gap through a deceptively simple innovation. Each battery carries a radar that detects rocket launches within seconds. A battle management computer calculates the trajectory and predicts the impact point. Only if that computer determines the rocket will hit a populated area does it authorize an interceptor. The Tamir missile then launches, tracks the incoming threat with its own onboard radar, and detonates close enough to destroy it. This selectivity is the system's genius and its limitation. It ignores rockets headed for open fields, conserving interceptors for real threats. But that means the system is constantly making calculations about what constitutes a populated area. Those calculations are based on maps and algorithms, not human judgment, and maps, as it turns out, can encode assumptions that have nothing to do with physics. On the morning of October 7, 2023, Hamas launched approximately 3,700 rockets toward Israel in the first 4 hours of the assault. The Iron Dome batteries activated as designed. They tracked the incoming salvos. They calculated trajectories. They fired interceptors at rockets headed for cities and towns. But roughly half of those rockets made it through. The initial assumption was technical failure, that the system had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire. And, in a narrow sense, that's true. Each battery carries only 20 interceptors per launcher. Once they're expended, someone has to reload them manually, under fire. On October 7th, the units assigned to reload those batteries were ambushed or pinned down. They couldn't reach the launchers. But the deeper failure wasn't about missiles or radar, it was about the assumption that defense alone could substitute for deterrence. For years, Israeli planners had focused their intelligence and preparation on Hezbollah in Lebanon, which possessed an estimated 150,000 rockets, far more than Hamas in Gaza. The assumption was that the real threat came from the north, and that Gaza could be contained through technology and border barriers. That assumption created a blind spot. Hamas observed the Iron Dome's capabilities for over a decade. They understood its saturation point. They knew that if they fired enough rockets simultaneously, some would get through. And they built their entire October 7th plan around that knowledge, not just the rocket barrage, but the ground invasion that would prevent the batteries from being reloaded. The system worked exactly as engineered. The doctrine around it failed entirely. There was a theory, widely accepted among strategists, that the Iron Dome would fundamentally change how Israel could respond to attacks. In previous decades, every rocket fired from Gaza created enormous political pressure for immediate retaliation. Civilians were dying, or living in fear, and governments had to respond quickly and visibly. That often meant launching operations before adequate planning, with, pretty predictable results. The Iron Dome was supposed to change that. By protecting civilians, it would give leaders time, days, even weeks, to make calibrated decisions rather than emotional ones. Defense would enable strategy rather than forcing its hand. But what actually happened was the opposite. The Iron Dome became so effective in public perception that it allowed successive Israeli governments to avoid making hard strategic choices altogether. Why invade Gaza to stop rocket fire when the rockets were being shot down at 90% effectiveness? Why accept the casualties of ground operations when technology could protect civilians from afar? Over a decade, this logic created what analysts now call the Iron Dome doctrine, a strategic addiction to defense that gradually eroded the willingness to take offensive action. Meanwhile, Hamas and Hezbollah watched and learned. They understood that as long as Israel believed the dome would hold, they could continue building their arsenals and refining their tactics with relative impunity. The doctrine of buying time became a trap. Time was bought, but it was never used, and the enemies used that time instead. There is another layer to this story that rarely appears in technical discussions. The Iron Dome's battle management computer makes split-second decisions about where a rocket will land. It classifies areas as populated or unpopulated based on mapping data. And those maps, it turns out, reflect systematic inequalities that predate the system itself. In the Negev region, dozens of Bedouin villages are not recognized by the state. They appear on no official maps. They have no bomb shelters, no public infrastructure, often no electricity or running water. When the Iron Dome calculates trajectories, these villages are frequently classified as open areas. Rockets that would land there are allowed to fall because the computer determines no population is at risk. This is not conspiracy, it's the logical outcome of a system designed to protect areas the state recognizes as populated, using data the state provides. But the consequence is that Palestinian citizens of Israel, particularly in unrecognized villages, face a double vulnerability. They lack shelters because their communities are not officially recognized, and they lack Iron Dome protection because their communities are not mapped as populated. After an Iranian missile struck the town of Tamra in June 2025, killing several civilians, the Prime Minister's office issued a statement that missiles don't differentiate between Jews and Arabs. That is true of the missiles themselves. But the defense system does differentiate. It differentiates constantly, algorithmically, based on assumptions encoded years before any particular rocket is fired. The Iron Dome matters not because it's miraculous, but because it's human. It represents our eternal hope that we can build walls high enough to keep out the chaos, algorithms smart enough to outthink the enemy, technology reliable enough to replace the terrible messiness of politics and war. And like every such hope before it, this one has proven partly true and partly false. The dome works. It saves lives that would otherwise be lost. But it also shapes the conflict in ways its creators never intended, creating new vulnerabilities even as it patches old ones. Understanding that paradox, that every defense changes the game, that every shield reshapes the hand that holds it, is the real lesson for anyone who wants to understand modern warfare. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to War Machiner, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most important stories about weapons are never really about the weapons at all.